Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Welcome to our series on the Sermon on the Mount. I want to read just a few verses from Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Well, most Bible translations place a gap between verse 10 and verses 11 to 12, as though the final statement was not properly one of the Beatitudes. But in reality, they are two Beatitudes that are pulled together into one. It's the same thought in verse 10 that is repeated and expanded in verses 11 to 12. Although the word blessed is used twice, only one characteristic is mentioned, and that is persecution. One commentator suggests that blessed is mentioned twice to emphasize the double blessing of those who are persecuted, and that the degree to which we fulfill the other Beatitudes might determine our experience in this final Beatitude. Before we can explore what Jesus means in these few verses, it's maybe, I think, quite helpful to consider just for a minute what he absolutely doesn't mean. For Jesus is not saying that persecution is a blessing. Jesus has been described as the world's greatest realist. He knew that his teaching would place him in confrontation with the religious and political powers of the day, and he knew exactly where that would lead. He had no doubts that he was journeying towards the cross. As his experience in the Garden of Gethsemane shows, he knew that the cross would be a painful experience, that he would rather not have to endure if there was any other way of avoiding it, of winning our salvation. But persecution is not a blessing. It is painful, emotionally, mentally, or physically, or a combination of all three. Willingness to endure persecution is a blessing because it shows our heart's true commitment to Christ and his cause. It shows that we value him and his cause more than we fear the suffering of persecution. Furthermore, the Beatitudes all look to the future when God's reign will be fully manifest, and so in that day we will see the blessedness of the righteous as they are vindicated and their persecutors are shamed. Secondly, Jesus is not saying that we should seek persecution. He's not advocating that we adopt some kind of martyr complex here. He's not suggesting that we somehow won't be real Christians until we are persecuted. You can't buy your way into the kingdom through martyrdom. And although that might sound like a mad idea, that's exactly what many of the Crusaders thought they were doing, and many Islamic militants and others think they're doing today. Rather than advocate that we seek persecution, this beatitude offers comfort to those who have suffered undeserved persecution. The persecution is undeserved because it doesn't result from our own foolishness or sinfulness. Instead, it results from our stand for the sake of righteousness, because we're being obedient to the call and the commands of Jesus. You can say from a human perspective that it was foolish of Bonhoeffer to oppose Hitler and the Nazi ideology in the way that he did. People were taken away to concentration camps for less than that. But Bonhoeffer felt that he had no choice because the Nazi ideology was completely opposed to Christ and his righteousness. And the tragedy of his time was that the vast majority of what became known as the German Christians, the official church, were siding with Hitler. At the time that Bonhoeffer was executed by the Nazis, he was still writing a book on Christian ethics. And it's, I don't think, accidental at all that the one text from the Sermon on the Mount that features in that book, unfinished as it was, is Matthew 5 verses 10 to 12. Bonhoeffer was persecuted to the point of martyrdom not because of his own foolishness, but because of his commitment to the way of Jesus and the lordship of Jesus over all of life. He didn't seek persecution, but he also refused to be silent, even if that meant being persecuted. And so Jesus isn't saying here that persecution is a blessing or that we should actively seek it. So what then does he mean? Well, we need to begin by being clear about what the Bible means by the term persecution. In the New Testament, the most common word for persecution denotes the result of physical or verbal harassment. It's often associated with the noun thlipsis, meaning oppression or affliction, a pressure being pressed down, like having a great weight placed on top of you. The context of the persecution is varied. It could be physical, it could be socio-economic, it could be emotional. For example, the churches in Revelation were experiencing imprisonment and martyrdom, as well as the loss of their livelihoods and social isolation. We should note that Jesus includes here both verbal insults and false accusations as persecution. And so persecution doesn't always include physical violence. If we want to understand these verses and how they might apply to us today, I think we've got to take a careful note of the circumstances in which the persecution occurs, as Jesus puts it. For whilst the term persecution is quite wide-ranging, Jesus is very explicit in defining the circumstances under which it occurs that leads to blessedness. Disciples are persecuted for the sake of righteousness and because of him. And it's with that in mind that we must be careful not to assume that every time someone treats us badly or rudely, it's because of our faith, because we are living a committed lifestyle, following Jesus, walking in his way. I've known some Christians who claimed they were persecuted at work because of their faith, when in fact the truth of the matter was that they were pretty rubbish at their job. Furthermore, Jesus doesn't say here, "Blessed are you when you are persecuted for being rude, inconsiderate, stupid, obnoxious, or incompetent." Now, let's be real for a minute. The fact is that Christians in the West have not experienced anything like real persecution for over 500 years. Fox's Book of Martyrs retells the stories of martyred Christians from the very first Roman persecutions through to the 16th century, when Roman Catholics and Protestants engaged in mutual persecution following the Reformation. Interestingly, the book jumps from the 4th century to the 16th because there were no major persecutions against Christians in that period, nor have there been any since the end of the Roman Catholic Protestant wars in the 16th century. Now, notice I said that Christians in the West have not experienced persecution, because it's not been the same story for Christians around the world, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries. Right now, at this very moment, Christians in Indonesia, Pakistan, China, North Korea and India, other countries, are suffering state-sanctioned imprisonment and even death because of their faith. In Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, things are even worse. Christians there are being tortured, killed, sold into slavery in unprecedented numbers. And some of the most ancient Christian churches in the world have been and are being obliterated. No one could honestly say that what our brothers and sisters in these countries are going through is a good thing or a blessed thing. And as noted, Jesus isn't saying that here either. I've no doubt that they wish they were not going through these terrible experiences, and yet these brothers and sisters are willing to endure such things rather than deny the truth that Jesus Christ is Lord and that he is their Lord. Whilst it's true that we are beginning to find ourselves subject to more and more opposition, and some of it is state sanctioned, and by that I mean that laws are being enacted that push followers of Jesus further and further into the margins of society, perhaps restrict our activities a little bit. I don't think what we are experiencing can really be compared to the persecution that our brothers and sisters around the world are facing day by day. But the question that keeps coming up for every generation, and perhaps increasingly for us, is what if? What if we were to begin to experience real persecution in this country? Would we stand firm and remain faithful to the Lord, or would we cave in for an easy life? We should also note that Jesus places the persecution of his followers in the wider context of history. For all the prophets before him have also been persecuted. So it shouldn't be in any way a surprise to his audience. And yet, we are surprised that people reject, often violently, sometimes rudely, a message that we think is good news. But Jesus warned us that that would be the case. In John 3:19, Jesus said, "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men loved the darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light, for fear his deeds will be exposed." And in John 15 verses 18 to 21, he says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me." Jesus knew that there would be wave after wave of persecution visited upon the church. And it's certainly the case that according to church tradition, all the apostles except John died violently at the hands of their persecutors. It's only because we have bought into the lie that people are basically good, or that we live in the fabled so-called Christian country, which doesn't exist and has never existed. We're surprised when godly people suffer persecution. But the fact is, following Jesus is confrontational to the world. Even if we are not verbally proclaiming the gospel, the righteousness of our lives confronts wickedness by providing a contrast to it. At least that's what's supposed to happen. I can't help but wonder if one of the main reasons that we are not persecuted is simply because our lives are not different, that they do not provide enough of a contrast to invoke a response. I wonder if the lack of persecution is a result of the fact that to a large extent the church in the West is neither living righteously nor proclaiming the gospel of Jesus uncompromisingly in word and in deeds. For most of us, most of the time, our lives are geared towards our own security and comfort, and fitting into the society around us is a key aspect of that. Biblical scholars, pastors and missiologists have been suggesting for some time that the Christianizing of Western societies has led to widespread nominal Christianity. It's this idea that because we are born in a Christian country, that somehow makes all citizens of that country Christian. But of course, in reality, there is no such thing as a Christian country. And so we are now in a situation where churches have many people in it who want to worship Jesus on a Sunday but not follow him daily in their lives. Although I wouldn't want to stretch the point too far, I think it's the case that people who do not fulfill the criteria of the Beatitudes that precede this one are unlikely to say or do anything that might result in persecution. Unfortunately, the picture that Jesus and the rest of the New Testament writers paint is very different. When the Thessalonian Christians were confused as to why they were being persecuted, Paul wrote to them saying that he'd sent Timothy to them to encourage them so they wouldn't be unsettled by their trials. And concerning those trials, he wrote, "You know quite well that we were destined for them. In fact, when we were with you, we kept telling you that we would be persecuted, and it turned out that way, as you well know." Jesus seems to be suggesting in this beatitude that suffering persecution is a normal part of following Jesus. It's an inevitable consequence of it. And certainly Paul, writing to the Thessalonians there, echoes that. The word translated as when can also mean whenever. So Paul does not appear to be suggesting that we should experience continual persecution, but that it should be taken for granted that we will. I believe that this is a message that we may well have forgotten, but actually we must rediscover, because I believe that we are entering a time when persecution against Christians who are walking in the way of Jesus, who are living a Christian life, and are Christian in word and deed and not in name only. Well, even for those of us who are trying to do that and be that kind of person in the UK, I think persecution will become more widespread and socially acceptable. Whilst it would be difficult in Western society democracies for there to be state-sanctioned violence against Christians, on a social level, we are generally speaking already regarded as narrow-minded bigots, idiots, fair game for every kind of ridicule or abuse. And as our society becomes more polarised on ethical and moral issues, this will only increase as we seek to remain true to Jesus' commands. In addition to that, we've already seen an increase in cases where Christians have either lost their jobs or been successfully sued because of their religious beliefs. And I think that's set to increase in the decade ahead. I think that in the future, Christians in the West, particularly in Europe, will find it more difficult to get jobs or benefits. And so we ought to ask, what should our response be if and when persecution comes? Well, if and when it comes, we'll be forced to reassess the extent of our commitment to the Lordship of Christ. And if we are convinced that He is Lord, to be followed and obeyed and not just worshipped, then we will have to declare that regardless of the consequences. As Glenn Stassen writes, these two teachings are the climax of the Beatitudes. They warn us realistically that the world is full of sin and will not always welcome our good news. Despite that, we work for the kind of delivering justice that God, in compassion for the persecuted and oppressed, works to bring about. The Apostle Paul was no stranger to persecution, and so he offers good words of advice we would do well to heed. He says, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whenever I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe in Him, but also to suffer for Him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now here I still have. Suffering for obedience to Christ and His commands, suffering persecution because we are seeking to live a life walking in the way of Jesus, is an inevitable consequence of that faithfulness and that obedience. And difficult as it is, Jesus is reminding us here that ultimately we are blessed, because in the end of all things, when everyone stands before the judgment seat of God and every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Jesus Christ is Lord, we will be vindicated.